Welcome to Extending Power Apps and Flow using Custom Connectors. My name's Ted Pattison. I'm from Critical Path Training. Note that for this session, I've made some slides available in some of the demo files. So if I move over inside of the browser here, and now I move over to GitHub, here is the Custom Connectors repository inside there, and you can see there's the slides. If you drill into the demo files, you'll find that there is the files that I'm going to be using during my demos today. Okay, and also, while I'm very excited to present an hour of Power Apps and Flow training, we also have a 2-day deep dive into Power Apps and Flow, and you can basically find out information about that on our website. If you basically want to either from where you are, remotely or in person, attend one of our classes. Basically it's 2 intense days of doing a lot of lab work and stuff like that. Okay, so let's go ahead and move into the content. So what I need to do at first today is just introduce the idea of what a custom connector is and what's its true purpose, as we start using them as we're building out solutions using Power Apps and Flow. We're going to walk through an example of creating a very simple custom connector with a REST-based OData API, and we're going to basically say how to create them and what are the things that are a little bit difficult or not intuitive. And then after that, we're going to look at a much more complicated scenario where our custom connector has to authenticate. And what we're going to be using today is the Power BI REST API as an example API that I can basically create a custom connector to call into that to get functionality that's not available to me natively in Power Apps or Flow. Okay, hopefully that sounds like a good agenda to everybody. Now let's set the stage. So in order to really appreciate custom connectors, we have to be working with the business application platform. 2 years back, we started hearing about Flow and Power Apps, and what were they? Were they a SharePoint thing? We weren't sure. And now what we see is that Microsoft has, put Power Apps and Flow along with Power BI, as center stage, as the no-code tools that we're using. And SharePoint and Dynamics 365, are both big audiences for what we're going to do with Power Apps, what we're going to do with Flow. Okay, now, if you're working with Dynamics 365, Microsoft has a standard database that all your business data goes in. And if you're working with Power Apps, you can use a subset of that database, which is the common data model. Okay, but if the common data model is, what we think of as kind of data that's native to the business application platform, there's a lot of data that we care about that doesn't live, inside of these, Dynamics 365 style databases. And that's where we use connectors and gateways to get out to this other data that I have in SQL Server, data that I have in SharePoint, whether it's SharePoint Online or SharePoint on-premises. Now, one of the big value propositions of Power Apps, is its appeal because you don't have to have classic development life cycles. Things are going to happen much faster. And so there's this dynamic where if they can abstract away your connections to databases, and to other types of data repositories, they can really create a, very simple to use environment for building out forms and different views. Okay, so you've probably used Power Apps before. Now, as we start getting more involved with custom connectors, one of the things that you might need to do is, instead of just having a Power Apps license that you get through Office 365 or you get through working with Dynamics 365, there's also PowerApps Plans 1 and 2. So working with a PowerApps Plan 2 license gives you a lot more capabilities if you want to create your own PowerApps environments so that you can have an isolated environment for, doing things like creating a custom connector and testing it so you don't have to do this type of work, inside of a PowerApps environment that you're using for, production apps. Now, let's go ahead and jump in and I'm going to go back to this UI. Let's get rid of this page of propaganda and get back to Power Apps. So here I am at web.powerapps.com. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to move into the data section And into the data section, we can see that we have entities. So if I was working with the common data service for apps, I could create a database here and I could work with those. That's not what we're interested in. The connections down here and the custom connectors, those are the two things I'm really interested in. Notice that it's in the data section, but it's kind of the external data that you get to as you start working with connections and custom connectors. Now, what is a connector? A connector, think of it as a piece of code. It's a wrapper around some web service or some other API. And when we want to use a connector, well, then we basically create an instance of configuration data, for that connector. That's what a connection is. So you can have one connector that allows us to get to SQL Server, but you can create many different connections, based on that connector, because one could have, a username and password. The other one could use, some other type of security. So we have connectors, we have connections. Now, what's great about this model is that when you have connections, we can start leveraging PowerApps and Flow to some degree to start building solutions where we don't need, a real development effort. Instead, people open up PowerApps. Obviously it's a lot easier to get up to speed on PowerApps, than on something like Visual Studio, doing web-based development. And there's this abstraction where the connector hands back a table of data. And then what we're able to do is quickly build our list views and our form views. So we have both table level binding and single record binding. Okay, now this is something where even if you're not using custom connectors, we do a lot of this work. What we'd like to do is bring in a custom connector and still do as much of the exact same type of work, where we just bind to tables and single record binding. What you're going to see is that it's a little bit more tricky than when you're using the connectors that come out of the box. Okay, but before we, approach custom connectors, it's good to have a firm understanding of how you just work with the standard connectors and connections, and being able to work, inside of PowerApps Studio, being able to use things like galleries and the view form and the edit form controls, and build out an experience, based on tabular data that's being fed to you, is an important thing. Okay, now let's talk about standard connectors versus custom connectors. So PowerApps and Flow support lots of connectors out of the box. For instance, let's go back over here. Let's go back to my connections, and I want to create a new connection. And now here are all these different connectors. So Microsoft's kind of touting this number of 230, different wrappers around different APIs that we can use. Okay, now if there is a standard connector, you should definitely use that. So the idea of a custom connector is that there isn't a standard connector for you to get to a place you want to go. So you need to create the custom connector. And a custom connector could be something where you have an API web service and Microsoft's never going to create a connector. You could have scenarios like I'm going to show with Power BI where they have a connector that does a little bit. They're just not giving you the functionality that you need. So we're going to basically create a custom connector that can retrieve data from Power BI, such as the list of data sets and when they were last refreshed. And we also want to add in this capability of allowing someone on a mobile phone, to see that a data set hasn't been refreshed in a while, just to click a button on the mobile phone and kind of have that trigger the refresh operation. So something I can do if I'm a developer, I'm creating a custom application, but what we're going to see is that custom connectors, can now start taking work away from these developers, by having one person who has to know a lot of detail, create a custom connector, and then have a whole bunch of other people that see the custom connector as a black box, but just begin to use it to get that functionality. Okay. Now, if I want to look at the custom connectors, let's go back here and note that we have custom connectors, and I've got a couple that I've already created that I'm going to be demoing inside here. And remember that the custom connector is specific to your environment. Let's do one quick thing here. Let's say that I go inside of the PowerApps homepage here. I'm going to go to the PowerApps Admin Center. When I go to the PowerApps Admin Center, what I should be able to do, is see the different, excuse me, the different, what am I trying to say? PowerApps environments. Okay, now my demo was now failing. Why is that? I had a trial PowerApps 2 license, and I forgot it expired last week, so I don't have an active PowerApps Plan 2 license, and that's what you have to have if you're going to be able to see the environments inside the Admin Center. Okay, so my apologies for letting you down on that part of the demo, but what I wanted to show over here is if we go back to just the regular PowerApps Studio, note that if there are multiple PowerApps environments, you can choose which one you're working in, and everything about connections and custom connectors, are specific to a particular environment. Once again, the idea is that you could build something out, in a staging environment, and then after you test it, you can export it and import it into your production environment. Okay, so let's keep going. Now, let's say I want to create a simple new custom connector. Now, if you already have a definition of a custom connector in either a Swagger or an OpenAPI file format, you'd be able to upload it. There's also a lot of technique that you can use if you have Chrome and the Postman extension, as far as being able just to kind of ad hoc create requests, test them, and then kind of capture what you're doing, inside of the file definition that we're going to be working with. Now, for my first demo, I'm going to go ahead and create a new particular custom connector. So let's go back here and under data, and here are our custom connectors. We're going to create a custom connector just by clicking on the Create Custom Connector. Before I do that, let's do a little testing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up here, and I have this web service. And my web service is something where it's subliminal systems, Azure websites.net/API/customers. And if I go ahead and I run that right here, you can see it's just returning some JavaScript object notation back. Note that in this case right here, if I go down to Tools and we look at extensions, I'm also using, one of the several possible Chrome extensions, that will take JSON and show it to you in a prettier format inside here. So notice that this is a REST API. So if I say /customers, it gives me all the customers. Let's go ahead and just, look at, if I bring up Notepad and I put this request inside here, well, how about if I don't want everything? So for instance, if we now put in a question mark, so we can pass in some OData parameters, and then we'll say $select equals, and notice that the names of the fields I can simply type in, and we'll have first name, comma, last name inside here. Okay, now once I have that inside here, let's go ahead and move back, and note that I can now start getting my results back with just a subset of the columns. Let's say that I go a little bit further right here, and in addition to that, we're going to put ampersand, and then we'll put $filter, and $filter equals. So now I have to come up with some type of a valid OData filter expression. So if I say something such as starts with, and then make sure that we use single quotes, not double quotes when we do that, we're going to have $filter starts with, and we'll have J, but now we also have to specify it's the last name field that I care about. Okay, so now that we got that, let's go ahead and append that all together. and we'll come back here and we'll put in the URL one more time. Okay, and now you can see I got all J's back. But one of the points I'm trying to make is that if you're building a custom connector, you need to be able to kind of understand OData query parameters, because you could feed those in and make your custom connector a lot more versatile. One other thing that I want to point out is I'm going to open up another developer tool. One of the things that you often hear Microsoft touting, is that PowerApps is the no-code platform, and there's plenty of areas where that's completely true. But there are other areas like this one, where all of a sudden you have to have developer-level knowledge, to really be successful. So I guess within the Power Platform community, developers are like lawyers. No one really likes them, until you need one real bad, and then you like them a lot. Okay, I digress. But what I wanted to show here is if I go ahead and refresh the browser, and then we go back over here to this tool. And with this tool, I'm going to go ahead and turn off the filtering for a second. And now that I have turned off the filtering, let me go ahead and come back here and take a look at this. And so what we can see here is that here's the get. When things are coming back, this tool also can show me exactly what is the raw data that's coming back inside. What are the JSON? And so this is going to be a useful tool to me in just a bit, as I go ahead and create my custom connector. Now, one last thing I want to do here is basically show that if you have customers, there is a OData specific way when you go to the collection of customers to point out I want one with a particular ID. So if I go ahead and I put a 2 inside there, what we're going to see here, and I don't misspell the endpoint right there, we can basically go back, and just basically pull, one thing at a time. Okay, and back here, once again, we should be able to kind of see that inside here. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and fearlessly, move in and create a custom connector. So back inside of the UI here, we're going to say create from blank. And what is going to be the name of this custom connector? Just to make things really obvious, we'll just name it Bob. It's our firstborn. So we'll go ahead and continue. Now, do you want to upload an image inside here? So if I quickly, just to illustrate, how we can do this, let's go ahead, find a image and upload it. Do you want a background color? So we'll go ahead and put something inside there. You got to use hexadecimal. Here is my description, and now down here, you specify what is the scheme, whether it's regular HTTP or whether it's behind HTTPS. So up here, let's go ahead and grab our URL and note that we want to basically put it, up to just the domain. So back inside here, we'll go ahead and add the domain inside here. And note that we also have kind of a /API/, which is the base URL. Any web service call is going to live inside there. Okay, so that is the first page of this wizard that we need to go through. Next, we'll click, and the second page is security. And so with the first demo, I want to just completely pass over this complexity. So luckily, we don't need any authentication because this demo web service I'm using, allows for anonymous access. Okay, probably something you're not going to encounter a lot in the real world, but anyway. Okay, and now we get to the actions page. So here is where you start defining the HTTP requests, some to retrieve data, some to add data. So let's go ahead and add a new action. So let's say the first thing that we want to do is to get customers. I want something that gets the customers. Maybe I want to parameterize it. So we'll give it a name, and we'll call it Get Customers. This is the summary. There are 3 things you have to add on this page. And so the second one, is going to be the description. And then the last one, is what we call the operation ID. So you can't have a space. And this is going to be the method name that is recognized by PowerApps when it calls, to your custom connector. So we'll call that get customers. Now, once we've done that, some of the things that we now have to do is define what the request is going to look like and what the response is going to look like. If I go back here, once we've created this new custom connector, we're going to define, what the request is. We're also going to have to go through and specify, do we need something such as a parameter, that gets a placeholder in the URL. Okay, so for the first one right here, I've created a new operation, get customers. Now, I go down below, and the first thing I deal with is the request. So down here, we're going to say import from sample. And so I'm going to say this is going to be a GET request, and what is the URL? Let's just go right back here and take, that customer's URL inside there. And now we'll come back here and we'll just go ahead and add that. If I wanted specific headers to be passed, I could add these inside there. Okay, now we'll go ahead and we'll do a import. Okay, so basically now you've kind of defined, what the incoming URL is. Okay, now what gets to be really important is defining the response. So let's go ahead and click on the add default response. What are the headers? If there were headers that were important, I put them in. In this demo, I don't really need to do anything. But now the next part is, what does the body look like as it comes back? So here is, where you can use this trick. Let's go back over here. Let's go use this tool right here. And so what I'd like to do now, is just basically run this one time. Once we've run that, I should be able to come back here. And if I go into this mode right here of raw, I now can kind of take this. And now that I have that, now things get to be a little bit tricky. I probably, want to have some type of a editor which can help me out inside here. So let's say that we go back, and inside here we'll go to custom connectors, and now I'll create a Word document, or just a text file, my response. And once I've got this response, let's go ahead and change the extension to JSON. Okay, now that I have that, I'm going to go ahead and open it up with something which is called Visual Studio Code inside here. Okay, it looks like I haven't copied that across, so I can just basically copy it from here. And now inside here, let's go ahead and paste that in, and then there's something I can do. Okay, now here's what a single item response looks like. But what I really need in this case, and I forgot to do this in the demo, let's go back here. At first, I don't want the single customer. I want the URL that's going to give me a collection of customers. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go back here, and if I go into raw, okay, now we can add this, and note that there might be 1,000 different customers, in this data. I only need the first one. So let's now go back here. And so in this case right here, what we'll do is we'll go ahead and, I didn't get that data back. I'm sorry. Let me try one more time. In fact, it might be easier just to view page source, take all this data, and now paste it inside here. Okay, so what I mean by you only need one back here. Let's go ahead and get rid of most everything. So we basically have two different things come back. And it turns out that you can include the first one or you can get rid of it. So now you have value, and you basically have this array. And all I really had to do is include the first one inside there. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take It's been a while since we've been, back here in this tool. So now let's put the body inside there. Let's go ahead and choose import inside. And now that we've done that, if you come back and you kind of take a look, note that I was able to parse through that JSON. So as you make the call and bring it back, it's going to create this object and hand it back to PowerApps. And that object is going to have a .address property and a .birth date property and a .city property. So once again, we're kind of creating, what the methods are going to look like. Okay, now that's enough for get customers. So now let's work on the next one, which is get customer. So for this one, let's go back here. And remember, this one, you put it into parentheses, and then you have that number come back inside. Okay, so watch what we're going to do here. When I feed this, into the PowerApps tool, I don't really want to hard code one particular ID. We're going to add a placeholder. So we're going to basically put curly braces in, and now we'll basically say customer ID. Okay, now let's work with that. So now back here inside of PowerApps, I've added my first action. Let's add the second one. So we had get customers. This is get customer. And we'll have the get customer summary inside here. Great. What is the operation? And that is just going to be get customer. Okay, now that we've done that, let's go define the request. So I go ahead and click on this. It's going to be a get, but now I add the URL, and what's very important is I have a placeholder that I've defined inside there. So we'll go ahead and we'll choose import. And now that we've done that, that is now part of the path. And the idea is that when I call this action from PowerApps, it will be a function that has one parameter, which is customer ID. So I can basically call that inside there. Now also, I want to go back and define the response inside there. So if we go back here, and now we kind of have the, the OData for exactly, one customer coming back. And so now if we say add default response, let me go ahead and put the body inside there, and let's go ahead and do the import. And then I come back here and I kind of click default. You can see it recognizes those as well. Okay, now we've done all the work to create a simple custom connector. So I click on create connector. And so at this point, it starts creating the connector, and everything's good. But now it comes time to test the connector. So here's one of those things where you just really wish things had worked out better. The problem is that in order to test your custom connector, you have to create an instance of a connection on top of it. And when you do that, there is this 5-minute wait period until everything gets provisioned across the network. So what I mean by that is, let's go ahead and create this new connection. And we'll go ahead and choose create. And after you've done that, we'll wait another second or two here. It now has created it. Okay, now, if I want to test this without having to create a Power App that calls it, one of the things that we can do is, let's go back to our custom connector. Let's go back into edit mode. Let's go to the very last tab, which is test. And before, all this was disabled because there was no connection created on your custom connector. Okay, now there is one. So let's go ahead and call a method. And what you're going to get for the next couple minutes is 404, resource not found. So it's just one of those unfortunate things where when you've done everything correctly, well, go ahead and create it and go get a cup of coffee, wait 5 or 10 minutes. And also what's, the other annoying thing, let me just get that out of the way, is that when you need to make a change, you have to go and delete the first connection. You then have to update the custom connector, save your changes, build a new connection, wait 5 minutes. Okay, so once again, it's not something that lends itself to a happy place for impatient people. Okay, now, I've already created one of these inside here. So let's go back, and I've already created one that basically is the exact same custom connector that you saw before, and that is the customer's web service. Now, I created this a while back, but what you'll see after waiting a couple minutes is that if I want to call get customers, I can go ahead, call get customers, and we should be able to see the call go out across the network. It came back with a 200. And then as I look down here, I can see things working. Plus, if I now go to the second operation, which is get customer, when you're testing it, I've only exposed one parameter, but you could expose parameters, for anything that you want. So in our case right here, let's say that I want customer 23, and we go ahead and it now makes that call out there, and I basically see the data coming back. And once again, status 200, which basically tells me that the call went across and was successful. Okay, now let's use this, inside of a Power App. So I have a Power App that I've already created here. And what I want to show is that when we want to use this Power App, we create a connection based on the custom connector if one has already not been created. And that's one of the things that we've done here. So if I go back to View and Data Sources, note that I've added the connection based on the custom connector that I have created. Now, once you do that, look at some of the things that we could do. So in our case right here, we have a gallery, and I want to fill that up with customers. So note that we have the items collection inside here. Now, if I come back here and I just call get customers, here's something that is an artifact from the fact that OData doesn't give you the array at the base of your JSON document. It has a value property, and you have to dip down into the value property, to basically get at that array of customers. But once we've done that and we've gotten, that array of customers, once I go back inside here, notice that I drop down, and basically, all the fields that I defined in that JSON response, are available for me to start working with, just as I would normally work with a standard connector, inside of a Power App. Now, also with this right here, what we're going to do is when someone makes a selection here, so let's go ahead and find the thing that I am looking for is the on select. And so if we look at on select, not that, on select. Okay, somewhere here I'm going to have to find it. That, and then let's go back. Okay, but I'm sorry, I'm going to find this in one more second. It's got to be here somewhere. Okay. Yes, so here's the code I'm looking for. So what we're going to do is we're going to call this other method getCustomer. But when I call getCustomer, what I'd like to do is I'd like to go ahead and find the ID for this customer. So notice that from gallery 1 selected, I'll basically, because I've loaded those objects in there, I'm going to have all the things that I would need, including the customer ID. Now what we can do is we can call that web service, call getCustomer, and that brings back an object. And one of the things that gets to be a requirement, is not directly binding that to something, but instead just basically taking that JSON object and basically pinning it to a global variable, or some type of a context variable inside there. So now I've created this current customer object. And so if we look at these, you can see that once we have the current customer object, we're able to bind inside there. So what we're trying to bind, what are we trying to build here? A UI, where I can see all the customers at once, or I can search and find a particular customer, but then once I find a customer, we can make another call, back to get the deep information. Maybe at first we just get 3 fields in each customer, but once you pick a customer, we now make another call back, and get 20 or 30 pieces of information, about that particular customer. Okay. So what you saw there as I went through and demoed, was that we're able to define the request. And when you define the requests, you can create parameters on things such as, query string parameters and form variables. Okay. You're also able to define the response, and the easy way to do that is to be able to get the piece of JSON, well, easy for a developer maybe, and to basically go through the process of pushing it through and creating that definition. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to look at, is a tougher problem, and that is how we authenticate with custom connectors. Now, before I go down this road, I want to quickly demo a project that I've been creating, as a developer. So if you're not as excited about seeing developer stuff, I'll just take a couple minutes here, but I need to motivate, how we could take things at the developer level and move them into a custom connector. So I have this application. And so this application uses an API, which is the Power BI REST API. Now, if I go back inside of Power BI and the Power BI portal here, and now I go and I find a particular workspace, it's the Wingtip Sales Analysis workspace inside here. What you'll see is that I have, a couple different reports, and it's the data sets that I'm really interested in here. So what I want to be able to do is, detect when has this data set, been last updated, or what is the refresh history. So let's go ahead and start up this application. And as I start this application, I'm going to do something here, and that is I'm going to go back into my friend Fiddler. Inside of Fiddler, I'm going to click on Filters, and I'm going to say Use Filters. And, I'm going to basically say, only show me a very small subset of things that I care about. Okay. And now what this application can do is give me all the different workspaces. Now, you have to authenticate, and I'm not going to step through the authentication code here, but the idea is that, this application can figure out, what are the workspaces in question, by making this call in and now, figuring out what are the different workspaces. Now, once I get a particular workspace, and I need to go down here and find the one that I'd like to demo, Wingtip Sales Analysis. Let's go ahead and click on Manage. And so one of the things that I want to bring out in this part of the lecture is that as you're using an API, you can basically see if I want to drill into a workspace, someone has to create a URL that, if you look at this one right here, groups, and there's a GUID, that's a workspace. If I, want to figure out, what are the data sets or the reports or the dashboards, it's just constructing the URL that gets to be important. Okay. Now, going a little bit further, let's say that I go to a particular data set in my custom application, and here's some kind of functionality you can't really get out of the box, and that is I can look at the refresh history, for a particular data set. Once again, if I come back, in this tool, and we start kind of looking at, these URLs, what we can see here is there's groups, there is the first GUID for the workspace, there is a second GUID for what data set, and then when I finally get to, the data set GUID and say /refreshes, I'm basically saying, show me the refreshes that occur. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and kind of look at our second example. So the second example that I have for you is going to be the Power BI Datasets API. So first, before I jump into security, let's go into the definitions. And what you could see here is that if I want to get the workspaces, what is that going to look like? it's pretty straight ahead. If I want to get the data sets in a workspace, well, now we have to have the workspace ID inside there. If I want to get the refreshes for a particular data set, now we have, the workspace ID and the data set ID. Okay. So, what you can see here is that it's just kind of following on the pattern that I showed before. Now, let's go ahead and open up the Power App that's going to consume this. So, back here, I'll head back to the PowerApps homepage. I'll find the app in question, the Dataset Manager. We'll go ahead and open that in edit mode. So what you can see here with this custom connector, when it finally opens up right here, is that I have a couple different screens. And so let's go ahead and start this up. And as I start this up, I want someone to be able to kind of see the different app workspaces inside there, and then be able to look at the different data sets, and then as they see a particular data set inside there, to be able to see the refreshes. And also I want to be able to kind of click on refresh data set and have that update. Now, there's this one little issue here. Let's go ahead and click on that. And that will basically push and do a data set refresh. If I come back over to the definition here, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around quite a bit. I'm trying to find the definition of this inside. And let me jump back inside here. And as I look at these definitions inside here, note that there's one, which is refresh data set. If I look down here, this one is a post. Now, sooner or later, if I wait around long enough and I go back to my application, what I might see is that I have a failure. And the problem is that they expect a 200 HTTP response to come back. And so you have to explicitly define that other response codes like 202 and 203, are not failures. At least that's kind of one of the rubs we've had for Microsoft, not to automatically include. And it's not really even Microsoft. It's kind of really the underlying API definition files, where we have to kind of call out individual response codes to determine whether they're, failures or successes inside there. Okay. Now let's look at the aspect of this with security. So here's this case where we need to define how authentication is going to occur. Okay. Now, even before I jump into this, let's say that just for illustration purposes, I create a new custom connector, and we'll create that from blank. And we created Bob before, so let's say this one, is Mary. And so we'll go ahead and choose OK. And let's go ahead and just kind of put some, basic info in here. Doesn't really matter what I have. But what I want to do is get to this security page right here. So what you're able to do is you're able to configure how your custom connector will authenticate. So you basically say, do I need a key? Are we going to be using OAuth 2, which is what we're going to be using? You can also use basic authentication if all you want to do is, pass a username or password. But we're going to pick OAuth 2. Once we pick OAuth 2, you'll see that Microsoft, gives you a choice of OAuth 2 support specific for, common places that we might want to read and write to, such as Azure Active Directory, GitHub, things like that. So you're able to pick one of these. Now, since I kind of show you it from the start, let's now go back to one I've already created. So what you'll see here is that, I picked OAuth 2, or I could pick Azure Active Directory inside there. But now you need these things that are the client ID and the client secret. So in order to, deal with those, we basically have to start working within our Azure Active Directory tenant and creating what's called a Azure application. Okay, so if I say portal.azure.com, what I'm able to do is go to a Microsoft provided page, and if I go down now until Azure Active Directory, and now we look at app registrations, what you'll see is that, let's look at all apps inside here just to kind of see some of the applications I have registered. So when my custom application, when that wants to call in and authenticate the current user, what you can see is that, I have to have a client ID and what's called a client secret, buried inside here. And also you have a reply URL. The idea of the reply URL is that your application is running somewhere at a well-known endpoint on the internet. And so when we go through this authentication process and Azure AD passes back a access token, it will only do it, to some type of a reply URL that's been registered. So these are the three pieces of information that we need. Now, when we start working with a custom connector that's going to use OAuth 2, we have to set up an application the exact same way. So for instance, let's go back here and say I want a new managed application. So this one will be my custom connector app. What type? It's going to be a web API. For sign-in URL, we really can't put in what we want yet. So I'm just going to say localhost 1234. Now that we've done that, we should be able to create it. Okay, now we've created the app. So we have this thing which is called the application ID or the client ID. So we're going to need that. Second, you're going to have to go and configure whatever permissions that your application needs. Since my application is be calling into the Power BI REST API, we have to go down to permissions. I'm going to go down to add. And now when I find the permissions for the Power BI Service API, I'll go ahead and pick those, and whatever particular permissions I need, we'll go ahead and select those. Okay, now for various reasons, you'll also are going to need to click this Grant Permissions button once you've configured permissions. And there's this issue where if you don't, it tries to bring up an interactive dialogue to the user. In a scenario where there is no user, we have unintended execution. So if I click on Grant Permissions, that will, that will solve that. Now the last thing that we need is this thing which is called a key. The idea of a key is you're kind of giving your application, or in this case your custom connector, a password, a secret that both it and Azure Active Directory know. And the way to do that is I can come up here. Difficult until you do it the first time. You just type a name, key 1, you give it a duration, 1 year. I go ahead and click Save. And now that you've done that, you have this one-time opportunity, to take this value and copy and paste it. Okay, let's go back to the slides. So what I had to do is I had to step through this process where I went to Azure AD and we create a Azure AD application. That's a web app, not a native app. You get the application ID. We basically also have to set whatever the required permissions are. We then grant permissions. Great. Okay. We create the key. And now we got these two pieces of information, the application ID and the secret. So let's say that we took those two pieces of information and we go and we create the new custom connector. We set up OAuth. We put those two pieces in place. Now, there's one more piece that you need, and that is, well, there's two pieces. I take that back. There is scope. So scope basically allows you to ask for the permissions that you need. Now, there's this little trick. If you leave scope empty, it automatically gives you all the permissions that are configured for your app. So only in a case where your app has 10 permissions, but you only want an access token with 3 of them, would you have to explicitly populate the scope. Now, the last one, the redirect URL. So the idea is that during this authentication flow, Azure is going to push the access token back to some endpoint, but we don't know what that is. So what we do is we take our custom connector and we save it. And once we save it the first time, they will fill in that redirect URL because, basically the PowerApps environment, has to come up with the URL that basically is needed for that callback with the access token. Okay. And once we get that set up, we can basically go back to our Azure AD application and put that in as one of the reply URLs and save it back. And the idea is that now I can call something like get datasets, and as I call get datasets, I get back the different datasets in a workspace. But you kind of see how I'm able to parameterize things inside there. And then just like the other custom connector, in order to test it, you have to create a new connection based on your custom connector, wait the traditional 5 minutes, and then the first time you use it, it actually goes through the authentication flow. And what happens is that you, might see a prompt, saying that you accept the permissions that you are getting inside there. And once you've done that, then you should be able to use it. Okay, now the last piece that I want to talk about, looks like we got about 5 minutes left, is how do we start dealing, with things that we have built as far as moving things between environments. So let's go back inside here. And what I want to look at is, I've got this app. Now let's take customer lookup. Now, one of the things that Microsoft has support for is exporting this app as a package. Let's go ahead and click on export. And so, this will be my, customers Power App. And so, down here, we can see that, hey, there's this related resource, which is the customer's web service. And so I have an option to pick across many choices. Actually, there's only one choice, select during import. But what you're going to see is that you can export this app and you can import it into another PowerApps environment. However, it's not going to automatically bring across the custom web service. So what we need to do is we need to move the custom web service across first. Now, one way to do that is if I go back here and I take my custom web service and I take it and there is a download button, it's going to download and it's going to create a JSON file. Now, inside of the demo files I gave you, what you'll see is I included JSON files for the 2 web services that I just demoed. Now, I'm going to go ahead and open these things up with Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code inside here. And let's go ahead and kind of take a look at the customer's web service first. Now, what you can see is that you have this definition, Swagger, info, host, and then you have the pass. So this is a fairly tedious file if you have to build it out by hand. But what you can see is if you say /customers and there's a get, well, here we define, the request, and, here we define the different responses inside here. So what you can see is it just gives us this format for defining things. If I look at the one that wraps the Power BI REST API, you're going to see that this has, a lot more to it. Plus the second one, also shows, the type of information that we might have, for OAuth. Type flow, we want the access code, here are the different URLs, so now you've seen that inside there. Let's say that I am working, in environment A. But now what we'll do is we'll move over to our production environment. Okay, I move to production environment, and we look down here, and there's no custom connectors. Okay, so let's import a OpenAPI file. What is the custom connector name? And this is going to be the customer API. And now I'm going to go down here. I'm going to find that particular file. We're going to go ahead and we're going to open that back up. And the idea is it should be able to load back in. No authentication. What are the definitions? Let's go ahead and create the connector. So let's create the connector. If your connector, has things like access tokens, those are never going to come across. You'll always have to kind of reinitialize them, inside of the new environment. But the idea is that you could bring your custom connectors over first, and then, once your custom connectors have been brought across, then you'll be able to, go through the import process for an app. And as you import the app, part of the setup will basically say, can you please point me, to the custom connector and its connection that we're going to use. Okay. Now, what you'll see is over the next 6 months, this story where we have to deploy apps and custom connectors individually is going to have a significant overhaul and become much better. So Microsoft is working on a kind of a single universal format so that you can build packages for distribution, from both the stuff that's come from Dynamics 365, so if you create things like custom entities, if you create model-driven apps, today those things can be packaged up as solutions. So they need to take what we're doing with PowerApps and Flow and custom connectors and basically, roll that into the same packaging for solutions that they have, with the other things that I just mentioned. Okay. Now, once again, as we end, if you like this kind of low-level, brain-hurting detail and you want more, I encourage you to go to the Critical Path Training website, take a bigger look at deep dive into PowerApps and Flow. Definitely lots of neat detail that we get into. But other than that, I appreciate everyone. I see a question earlier from Bill White saying, can we get a copy of the slides? Remember that the slides are available inside the GitHub repository. So if I finish off by going to github.com, Critical Path Training, Custom Connectors, there are the slides right there. And there's also a couple different demo files. So thanks, everyone, for spending a little bit of time with us today at Critical Path Training. And we don't have any more webinars currently on the schedule, but look, next week we'll probably announce something over the next month. And if there are webinar topics that you'd love to hear about, go ahead and send us a note. So other than that, have a great rest of your day.